This is perhaps the strangest and most disturbing thing that's ever happened to me, and to this day I still can't explain it. I still think about whether or not something similar will happen again in the future, but luckily so far it hasn't. Back in high school, I used to visit our city's park regularly. It was pretty big and included a playground, soccer fields, baseball fields, a skate park, and a few other things. I'd usually go there after school since it wasn't far from where we lived, and I'd shoot some hoops or just walk around, taking in the natural ambiance. This one day I went there, it was a little after 4, but a storm was coming in, so the sky was much darker. The park was deserted, or at least I couldn't see anyone in my immediate vicinity. There was also a cool breeze, which was very refreshing. My mom cautioned me not to spend too much time there or I'd get caught in the storm. Of course, me being a big bad high schooler, I didn't necessarily take her advice. I walked over to one of the smaller concrete courts and started practicing some layups, but then I heard a noise from somewhere behind me. It sounded like some of the play equipment squeaking, and not necessarily like a swing. The playground was only about 100 feet away, but when I looked, I couldn't find anything that might have made that noise. So I started practicing the layups again, but not even a minute later I heard the sound again. This time my curiosity got the better of me and I walked over. This particular playground did have a swing set, as well as a playscape with slides, monkey bars, a little rock wall, and other bars and ladders to climb up and down. First, I sat in the swings and pushed myself back and forth, trying to see if I could make the sound, but I couldn't. Next, I walked through the playscape, pushing and pulling various parts of the equipment, but nothing made that sound. I was sure the sound had come from somewhere on the playground, and it had sounded deliberate. I got the sense someone was messing with me. I did one last 360 and then started walking back over to the basketball court. At this point, the wind had picked up and it was starting to sprinkle, so I figured I'd leave in about 10 minutes. But not even 30 seconds later, I heard the sound again, only this time it was much louder. It sounded like whoever made the noise was literally right behind me. I turned around to see the most horrifying thing in my life. There was a figure, all in black, at least 10 feet tall. I'd say they were wearing a black trench coat or something, but they literally appeared completely black. I couldn't even tell what they were wearing. The only features I could make out were their eyes, nose, and mouth, which were all glowing. I couldn't even tell if they were smiling or frowning, because the next thing I remember is waking up on the grass with the rain hitting my face. I felt this weird sensation like I'd been hanging upside down, but been dragged up until I was lying on the ground. There's no other way to explain it. My head was buzzing, but I didn't have a headache though. After a few seconds I sat up and looked around. The sky was much darker, and it was raining harder, and the park was still deserted. My blood ran cold as I remembered that thing I had seen right before passing out. I scanned my surroundings again while trying to get up. I didn't see it. I realized my legs were wobbly and almost fell over, but I managed to keep standing. I started walking back home, and when I felt ready, I started running. I pulled out my phone, and to my surprise, it was only 4:30, meaning I'd probably been out less than 5 minutes. When I got home, my mom saw I was drenched, and told me in an exasperated tone to take off my shoes and socks, and try not to get the carpet wet. I went to my room and put on fresh clothes, then sat down on my bed and tried to figure out what the hell just happened. A couple possibilities crossed my mind, including being struck by lightning. But I didn't feel like I'd been electrocuted, and all of my clothes were okay, so I knew it couldn't be that. That left 2 possibilities. Either I hallucinated for some other reason, or what I saw was real. I figured it had to be a hallucination, as nothing about what I saw made sense. I mean, how was that thing 10 feet tall while being completely black except for a glowing face? But then that raised the question of, why did I hallucinate? I don't think I'd ever hallucinated before, at least not that I remember. I've had headaches from time to time, but never anything like migraines or seizures. And I hadn't gotten hit in the head recently, and I'd slept decently the night before. My best guess is that it had something to do with the storm, though I'm not sure. I researched a bit online, and apparently the lower air pressure can sometimes affect people in different ways. So I guess that's what happened, even though storms never seemed to affect me before. But ultimately, I still wonder, could I have come face to face with a paranormal entity? When I was like 8 or 9, my friend and I would go to this unfinished part of our neighborhood, which had a creek, and play around in it. There were also some concrete pipes, which presumably would connect up to the drainage system when it was finished. We'd bend down and walk through them, playing hide and seek or just running around. I'll call my friend Ryan for this story, and he had a little brother who I'll call Tim. This story takes place one Saturday afternoon. I'd gone over to Ryan's house that morning, and we'd been playing on his PlayStation since then. We were playing some weird game where you were in a hovercraft, shooting at stuff, and there were radioactive barrels that would explode. I honestly can't remember the name of it. Anyway, we couldn't go outside since it was raining pretty hard, and there was lightning. However, when the thunderstorm ended and the sun came back out, Ryan's mom highly encouraged us to go outside and get some exercise. At first Ryan was annoyed, but then I told him that the creek would probably have water in it, which for some reason we found thrilling. I don't know, we were like 8 at the time. Tim overheard us and wanted to come too, and Ryan's mom told us to be careful. So the 3 of us stepped outside and walked 2 blocks in our neighborhood to the creek. The last block was just dirt, with concrete foundations where they were going to build new townhomes, I think. When we got to the creek, we were all disappointed. There was like barely a stream of water. We still walked down into the creek and jumped in a few puddles and walked up and down a bit. Then Ryan suggested we explore the concrete pipes, so we walked over to one of the pipes leading into the side of the creek. Now that I'm older, it seems strange that there wasn't a grate or anything else to stop kids or animals from coming inside, but I guess no one cared. We started walking inside towards the first little concrete room, which had several other pipes leading into it. But when we got there, we realized the ground was muddy and also completely submerged in water. None of us really wanted to walk through there, so we turned back. Tim was the first to get back to the outside, and when he did, he started yelling. Ryan and I came out too and saw that there was significantly more water in the creek. Looking back, I suspect this was because it was still raining somewhere upstream, or the rain was finally flowing into the creek from other areas. We all started laughing and jumping around, pretending to be frogs or something. Then Ryan walked through the middle of the creek, which was like a foot deep at that point. While we were there, we noticed the water kept rising, which we were really excited about. At some point, Ryan ended up on the bank closest to the neighborhood, while me and Tim were on the other side, which led to a forest, I think. Now the water was about 4 feet deep and flowing faster, and I think this is where Ryan and I started to become a bit concerned. Tim was only like 4 or 5, and we weren't sure if he could make it by himself. I wasn't even sure if I could make it. That left us 3 options: try to cross the creek, try to find a way around, or have Ryan tell his mom we needed help. For context, neither Ryan nor I could swim well, and I'm pretty sure Tim couldn't swim at all. Tim was apparently fearless and wanted to try walking across, and Ryan said that if we went through together, we'd be fine. Initially I was on board with that, but when we started to wade into the water and I felt how fast it was moving, I stopped and started to argue that it was too dangerous. Ryan called me a pussy, but I think he just low-key didn't want to seem scared himself. I pulled Tim back away from the water and scanned our surroundings. There were lots of trees, but there weren't any fallen logs that we could use to make a bridge. The creek was like 10 feet wide at this point, and there didn't appear to be anywhere narrower nearby. I wanted to go search farther for something to use as a bridge or a better place to cross, but I was worried the water would just get higher. Then we had an idea. I told Ryan to go to one of the construction areas and look for a board or something. Tim and I waited on our side of the creek for what seemed like an hour, and now Tim's optimism had turned to fear as well. He actually started crying at one point, and I had to reassure him. Finally, Ryan returned with a piece of rebar and told us to hold onto it as he swung it across the water. From this point on, everything seemed so surreal. I remember Tim and I grabbing onto the other end of the rebar, and I felt Ryan start to pull us across. Tim was in front of me. 3 or 4 feet into the water, it was moving with so much force that I almost lost my footing, and I put my arm around Tim so he wouldn't fall over. My heart was pounding inside my chest, and right when I was about to tell Ryan we should turn back, Tim and I both lost our footing and plunged into the water. I don't know how we all managed to hold onto the rebar. I guess it was just the adrenaline in our veins. As we all held on for dear life, the force of the water made Tim and I pivot around, and we ended up on the bank leading to our neighborhood. Tim and I were both completely soaked, and I started coughing up some of the water that got into my throat. Tim started screaming and crying and ran to Ryan, who threw his arms around him. We just stood there for 5 minutes, not saying anything. Then Ryan started walking back, and Tim and I followed without saying a word. I walked back to their house with them, and then they walked inside while I went home. By that time, I'd started to dry off, and my mom was only mildly upset with me, but I didn't care. I don't know if Ryan's mom scolded him or not, but I'm pretty sure they didn't tell her what happened. Ryan and I were still friends after that, but something about our friendship changed, and we never really talked about it. Eventually my family moved away right before I entered high school, and I never kept up with them. I still think about this experience sometimes, and I don't think I'll ever be able to process things fully. I'm just glad that we were able to hold on to the rebar. This happened when my sister and I were kids, and it is hands down the most terrifying experience of my life. I assume it's the same for her as well. It was a Saturday morning, I think, during a torrential downpour. It was essentially still pitch black outside. Our dad was a truck driver, so he wasn't there, and our mom had to run some kind of errand. She worked as a receptionist at this office building, and I think she had to help with catering this office party, but I'm not completely sure. Long story short, my sister and I were left alone for a few hours, basically to do whatever we wanted. I'll call her Sally for this story. Sally and I loaded up on junk food while searching through our parents' rather extensive library of VHS tapes that they kept since they were kids, I think. We found this one tape in one of those generic unmarked boxes, meaning it was probably a blank tape that had been used to record something on TV. Sally and I put it on and were immediately creeped out by it. All I remember is that there was a kid who got scared, and then his hair fell out, and then he put this hair growth stuff on his head to try to make it come back. Eventually we shut it off and put it back, and to this day I have no idea what that movie was called. Low-key, I don't even know if that was a movie, or if we didn't just hallucinate the whole thing. Maybe because we had just watched it, and Sally and I were both weirded out. When we heard tapping at the door, we both jumped. I'm 2 years older than Sally, so I went to the door while she stayed on the couch. I looked through the peephole to see an old man. Immediately I felt sketched out. For one thing, he had just been tapping on the door, not even fully knocking. For another, he was wearing this old black hoodie and blue beanie, and looked like he hadn't shaved for a while. His eyes were wide and expressionless, as he appeared to be staring right at the peephole, and when he opened his mouth and yawned, his teeth looked yellow and disgusting. I just stood there for a while, not sure what to do. Our mom had given us strict instructions not to open the door for any strangers, and while I sure as hell wasn't going to open it for this man, I didn't know if it would be best to watch him to see if he did anything, or if I should hide with Sally in one of our rooms. The man kept tapping on the door, and when Sally asked me who it was, I shushed her. I'm not sure if the man heard that or not, but he said hello in this high-pitched, disturbing voice. I was still frozen as Sally whispered to me and asked what was going on. Eventually I backed up away from the door and walked back over to the couch. I told her about the man and she started crying. I led her to my room and locked the door. The blinds and drapes were already closed, so we doubted the man could see through the window. I'm not entirely sure why we didn't call our mom at this point. Maybe because we were little kids. We thought that if we ignored the situation, it would go away. With the door closed and the rain pouring down on the roof, we could no longer hear the tapping, but I figured that man was still out there. So Sally and I just waited. For what exactly, I'm not sure. After 5 or so minutes, we debated about whether or not to open the door so we could listen for the tapping. However, nothing could have prepared either of us for what happened next. As I was talking to Sally, she screamed. I turned my head to see the silhouette of the man standing outside the window. A moment later, he started tapping in that same quiet, consistent way he'd done earlier. I screamed as well, and Sally and I ran back out of my room and picked up the house phone to dial our mom. She didn't pick up, and we didn't know what to do. Just then we heard the sound of breaking glass coming from my room. We screamed again and ran into the bathroom, which didn't have any windows. We locked the door and turned the lights off. Waiting in there with Sally with the lights off and sound of the rain on the roof was the most terrifying experience of my life. I fully expected to hear footsteps outside, but I didn't. About 15 minutes later, we heard the garage door open, and then the door leading to the inside open. We heard our mom's footsteps and unlocked the door and ran to her, crying. She was immediately concerned and asked us what happened. Apparently, she didn't notice anything out of place as she drove up. When we told her about the man, she started freaking out, as there was a possibility he was hiding in our house somewhere, possibly armed. Our mom called 911 right away and had us go back into the bathroom to wait. The cops showed up in about 5 minutes, and they conducted a thorough search of our house and yard. The man was nowhere to be found. They found the window that had been broken. It was one of the windows in my bedroom. Oddly enough, only one small piece had come off. Not even enough for the man to crawl through or reach in and unlock the window. Our theory was that the man was just continuing to tap, and when he actually broke the window, he decided it was time to leave. Our mom was understandably on edge for a few weeks after that, and low-key, we were too. The cops said they'd patrol the area, but I guess they never caught the man. Our dad couldn't get back to us quickly, but when he eventually did, he burst through the door and hugged us, telling us how thankful he was that we were all right. He had a security system installed, but that never showed anything. I still think about this experience from time to time, and I can't help escape the thought of what that man's intentions were, and what would have happened if he'd been able to carry them out.